Okay, so again, this is Aristotle 360 Financial Transactions and Reporting, special webinar today. Last week we covered, or sorry, not last week, but in the last webinar we covered some basics about using Aristotle 360 and its interface. Today we're going to focus more on financial transactions, entering them, reconciling them, and how those end up on reports. So, just a quick recap, if you were here for the last webinar, you'll remember we went over 3 different ways you can enter financial transactions in 360. The first was quick entry. Now, quick entry allows you to go through a series of transactions and enter them in rapid succession. You search for an individual, choose some basic information from the tabs here for the type and the fields below, and then you can quickly add those to a record as you go. Another area that we covered was going to the File menu, where you can enter new receipts and disbursements from the links here. Finally, we went over being able to add transactions from an individual record screen. Now, in individual records, there are panes that can be expanded for receipts and disbursements below. And we went over the basic receipt entry here, which is this window. Today, we're going to be using the more detailed window, which opens up when you click on additional details. Now, in 360, it's important that you have correct data entry for transactions. This is how they're reported in a compliant manner on various different government reports, and it's also obviously important for your bookkeeping that transactions are entered accurately. The most basic fields necessary to enter a transaction are only the amount, the date, and the type and subtype. Some of these other fields will be reported, but those are the most core fields that every transaction needs to have correct. We're going to go over type and subtype in some detail today, but let's go ahead and go through the rest of these fields on this page, and we'll take a look at what these are. Now, the check number is for your own records. You can use these on certain reports, and you can search by them, but mostly they're for being able to determine what check corresponds to a transaction, so they're fairly internal in nature. I'm going to skip type and subtype, but we'll definitely go over those in detail in just a minute. The committee allows you to determine if you have multiple committees that you report through your 360 account. This allows you to determine which committee this transaction is attributed to. And this is, of course, particularly important if you do financial reporting to a reporting authority, such as the FEC, because you'll generate those reports by the committee, and it will filter transactions down to the ones that were made under that committee. The account is for keeping track of bank information. Once again, when you run financial reports, you can choose which accounts you want to include in that report. So this can be helpful if you have different kinds of bank accounts for different candidates, and you need to be able to keep certain transactions there. You can choose these on a report, and you can also keep track of your bank account balances by having these correctly entered. The period box is for determining which period a given transaction is attributed to, and we're going to go over adding and editing those periods later, but note that you can select that here from this drop-down menu. Batches are strictly internal, and they're for keeping track of your transactions, of course, and tallying particular receipts lists or disbursements lists. If you have an advocate on this transaction that you need to report, you can choose that here. And if it's related to a pledge, you can also choose to attribute this to a particular pledge, and that will keep a running total on the individual's record. You can enter a reporting purpose for transactions here, and on some reports these reporting purposes are displayed. You can also enter a deposit date, and those deposit dates are automatically entered as today's date. And you can also have them be set when you reconcile transactions, and we'll go over transaction reconciliation. There are some basic fields here for different dates relating to different transactions, and you can also choose the status to display whether or not this transaction has cleared, the options are visible here. You can record whether a check was voided. If you want to report a transaction in a particular state, you can select that here. And if this transaction is entered to an activity campaign, you can also select that, or an event. As you can see, if you have a source for a transaction, you can either create a new source here or link that source to this particular transaction in this field. The interest rate is for loans. You can enter that here. As you can see, you can recognize a transaction. If that transaction is needing to be reported in a later period, you can enter that information here. And you can also enter internal notes if you need to show these. And one particular item to note about the notes field is that these notes can be displayed on checks. So if you need a particular memo to appear on a check, this is the field where you would enter it. Now, for independent expenditures in support or opposition of a political candidate, you can do that here. And frequently asked question is, once you've checked that box, how do you mark which candidate this transaction is to support or oppose? And the answer to that is that once you've chosen to save the transaction from the top, a new set of fields will appear. So in this case, we could check oppose, and we would be able to choose the candidate and enter their ID and information after we've saved the transaction. If for a particular reason you need to itemize a transaction on a report that doesn't meet the itemization threshold, or if there's a transaction that shouldn't be itemized for whatever reason, you can choose to do that from these checkboxes. And this corresponds to particularly FEC reporting particular transactions. If you want to show those, this box is particularly useful to force itemize. Now, if we go back up to type and subtype, in order to be compliant on entering transactions, these are the most important fields. They'll determine where on your reports these are shown and certain aspects as to what information is shown. So we're going to go ahead and cancel out of this, and we'll go to the help file under Help, Online Knowledge Base. There's a very useful piece of documentation here that will show you the corresponding type and subtype for the Form 3 here, FEC Form 3 types and subtypes chart, and also for the Form 3X. So it depends on which form you're filing, which of these select. And there are help files for various different state reports as well. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the Form 3. As you can see, this is a table that shows you which line number particular types and subtypes appear on. So on your report, you can determine which types of transactions you want to report. You can find the correct line number, and then you can see which types and subtypes will be able to be reported on that line. Today, we're going to go over one particularly tricky transaction, and that's loans. So, line 13 for loans can be shown here. And as we look to the right, we can see that this corresponds to legislators, organizations, and banks. And that the type, the main type on this transaction is loan, and the subtype can be made by a candidate, guaranteed by a candidate, or, sorry, that's actually made by a candidate or guaranteed by a candidate. So, if we close that window, we can go back to our Abraham Lincoln record. We're going to go ahead and have Mr. Lincoln issue a loan. So, actually, we're going to have him receive a loan today. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a new receipt to show the acceptance of these loan funds. Now, as we saw from the chart, the first thing we're going to want to is choose the loan as the type of the transaction. I'm going to go ahead and enter an amount of $1,000. We can leave today's date, and there won't be a check for this transaction, but there could be if you wanted to record that information. Now, as subtype, we're going to choose received. I'm okay with putting this in my main account in this case, but if there's a particular bank account which this transaction should be attributed to, you want to choose that here. We're going to leave the current period, and we won't be using a batch for this, just as the example. So as you can see, The important part about this transaction was choosing the type and subtype. Now we're going to go ahead and save the transaction and close it. Certain types of transactions, in order to report and total correctly, need to be linked to one another. The reason we're choosing a loan today is because this is an ideal example of this. When you make a loan, obviously there are subsequent repayments of that loan, and those transactions need to be linked to the original. So if we look at receipts, we can see that our $1,000 loan made today has been entered under Abraham Lincoln's record. Now, if we wish to enter a repayment to this loan, we'll go down to disbursements. As you can see, we've already set up a $1,000 repayment of this loan to the same date. Now, in order to link these two transactions, we'll reopen the loan transaction and go to additional details. As I mentioned previously, for certain types of transactions, there are more options that appear after the transaction has been saved, and these are specific to the type and subtype. In this case, because this transaction is able to be linked to new transactions, there's an Add Transaction Links pane at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and expand that pane and add a new link. Now, when you're adding a link, what you begin by doing is finding the transaction you wish to link to. So what we have is a disbursement in repayment of this loan. So I've selected disbursement. I've correctly selected the entity type individual. I'm going to go ahead and enter Abraham's name. And I know this transaction was made today, so I'm going to go ahead and enter today's date. Now, you can use the other criteria here to narrow down on your transaction. For example, we know that the type will be loan, but I happen to know this is the only transaction on Abraham Lincoln, so this is enough information to locate the item. I click on the search button, and as you can see, we have, well, two different transactions that were entered today for Abraham Lincoln under disbursements. Now, we know that this is the loan transaction here for $1,000, and it's got the subtype repayment, so we know that's the correct one. I'm going to go ahead and click Link to link these two transactions. And what we receive is this confirmation window reading, the records are linked, a new link has been created. Now, we can see this on the individual transaction, so if I save and close, we'll be able to open the disbursement and see from that side that this transaction has been linked. And as we can see, we open up our loan. And scroll down to transaction links. As you can see, the linked receipt is attached to a linked disbursement. And in this case, our totals are the same, so our loan has been repaid. So, once again, when you're entering transactions and you need those to report in a compliant manner, the most important step is to make sure that you choose the correct type and subtype. In certain cases, such as loans or memo items on, for example, a credit card repayment, you'll need to link the transactions together as well. Now, once you've entered your transactions, it's important to be able to search for them and pull up lists and exports to see particular types, subtypes, and your total transactions. So, we're going to go ahead and recap on search and receipt search. As you can see, we've got some basic fields here we can pull up our transactions by. Now, we have a $1,000 loan we're looking for, so let's go ahead and look for today's date. So what we're returned is a list of the transactions, in this case just the one. One of the useful things we can do from this page is to export these transactions. So if you had a number of transactions in one of those in an Excel sheet, you've got the export option right here. Another item we can do is to add fields and calculations. As you can see, we can choose our export fields from this page. A particularly useful field are these calculated fields, and in this case we've got receipt fields. So we can go ahead and add the average contribution for Mr. Lincoln, and we'll apply that. When you add calculated fields, there are sometimes new criteria that you're able to enter on that particular option. In this case, we can set the dates and periods on our calculation for average contribution. We're going to go ahead and push this back to the beginning of reporting time, which in most cases is 1900. And we'll click Apply. As you can see, if we scroll over, we've got an average contribution amount of $550. And if we had multiple contributions, we could sort by that amount by clicking on the title field. This is a useful ability if you need to spot check your transactions. You can pull up receipts by a certain type. You can pull up all loan transactions. You can look through them on this page, and you can open the particular transactions or individuals' records by clicking on these links here. Just to walk through our export process, if you wanted those transactions in a paper form, you can choose Export, and you'll be taken to the export page. Now, we went over this export page for individuals in the last webinar. In this case, there are not additional available fields because we're not selecting for individuals. We've already added the fields we want to export. But we can choose our format between Microsoft Excel and comma-separated value. And for large transactions, we can choose to be notified once the processing is complete. I'm going to go ahead and click on Export. And as you can see, we have an Excel file available for download immediately. Another type of export we can do is from reporting and financial reports. There are a number of useful reports here. One of the most commonly used when you're doing financial transactions is, of course, the transaction report. This is a very useful page because it gives you a lot of options about which kind of transactions you want to select and export, and a number of formats available immediately for export without loading the export application. So in this case, we can go ahead and choose receipts or disbursements, but we'll choose receipts. And we'll set our type to loan. We can choose the kind of entities that we want to export from these fields. So if we want to include organizations and committees, we simply check the boxes corresponding to those. If we had a particular type of entity that we were searching for example, an individual, we could search for them here and add them to our list, but we're going to leave this open-ended. If you have a list saved from a previous search, you can also load that list here. We can click on the magnifying glass, and as you see, the lists that have been previously saved in this database are available to do this export from. Once you've chosen the entities that you want to export, you can select the date range for which the export should be run. In this case, I'm just going to run from 2 years ago through the conceivable future. If you have a statement date on those transactions, you can also search by that. Particularly useful if you're trying to look over a bank statement and you've already reconciled those transactions. Now, we're going to pull this for all filing committees. However, if you did want just a single filing committee to show up on this report, it's possible to choose that here. And also your bank account. Once you've chosen your filing committee, you can choose the associated bank account from this box. Some other options available. You can select to report a particular batch or a particular election period. And you can also choose from a particular source. Once you've chosen the selection criteria to choose what will be exported, you can choose the report criteria to choose how it will be exported. There are two different major report types. The first is a detailed report, and this is selected by default. The detailed report shows every transaction that meets our search criteria with a list of information to the side. We'll see what information is included in just a minute. The summary report is also known as a roll-up report, meaning that each individual entity has all of their transactions rolled into a single line. So Mr. Lincoln, who has only one transaction in this case, would have the same fields on either report. If we had entered 3 or 4 loans under him, the detailed report would show each of those loans, whereas the summary report would roll them into a single transaction, and we'd see a total for Mr. Lincoln. We're going to go ahead and leave the detailed report. We can choose to group by a particular type, but we're going to leave that blank. We could also choose to sort. In this case, we have a single entity exporting, so we'll choose name, but obviously we can't sort one over another. Of export types, the most commonly used export types are PDF and CSV. CSV is opened in Microsoft Excel in most cases. In some cases it's OpenOffice, but it's a standard spreadsheet format that most computers can open easily. The PDF format, which we're going to take a look at right now, is openable in any PDF viewer, Adobe Reader as an example. When you run this report, you'll be able to see what information is included. So, as you can see, we have our single transaction in this particular report. We can see the dates that we pulled the report from, and in this case we specified a type, so we can see that type here. In the top left corner, you can see the date the report was pulled, and in the itemization field you can see a running list of the individuals who meet that report criteria, and a particular total at the end. The transaction report is useful for exporting lists of transactions. Recall that if you export a list of individuals, you can see particular transactions or totals, but if you want to be able to get a list of all the transactions for checking purposes, this is the place to look. Now, earlier I said we would cover entering new periods into the 360. New periods can be entered under Settings and Add Edit Election Periods. Periods are important not only for correct reporting, but because you can set your contribution limits for different entity types in the period selection. And what this does is it gives you a warning in case a particular entity has exceeded their contribution limit. A warning that would let you either move on to a reattribution or relocation, or in some cases you'll be forced to return the contribution. Now, as you can see, we have a number of periods set up in this database. We're going to go ahead and add another. You can choose your default period from the default period box, and you can also edit the period or the limits. Let's go ahead and create a period for 2012. So we'll scroll down to the bottom and choose Add New Period. As you can see, this gives us the ability to name our period and the date corresponding to the period. So we're going to choose 2012 as our name and the election date here. And you choose Insert when you wish to create the actual period. So, as you can see, I don't have permissions to create periods on this account, but they'd normally be entered here. If you wish to edit a period that already exists, you choose the Edit Period column. Here you can change the name or the date associated with the period, and choose Update when you're finished. Don't forget that it saves a lot of time in entering transactions if you set your current period as the default with that checkbox. Now, once you have your period entered, you're going to also want to be able to set up the transaction limits for particular entities. You do this by clicking on the Edit Period Limits page. Here, you can choose to edit for a particular entity, such as an authorized committee in this case. We can change the limits for here for both receipts and disbursements. You can also edit a particular period by selecting it, or multiple periods, and entering an amount here. When you click Reset Limits, they'll be reset to the targeted amount. Another important area that helps with entering transactions is setting the default transactions for different types. This is also available under Settings by going to Global Transaction Defaults. Here you can choose to set defaults for the receipt types and subtypes, disbursement types and subtypes, the filing committee or account that you use, the receipt source, and also the default election period. As an example, let's go ahead and take a look at receipt types and subtypes. As you can see, from this page, we can set different types or subtypes as the default. Let's go ahead and set contribution as the default. As you can see, a checkbox appears. In order to edit these subtypes, you click on the type name, and you'll be able to see a list of subtypes associated with that type. As you can see, check is set as the default on this, which is the contribution type. Excuse me. What this means is that if you were to choose from File, New Receipt, our default type and subtype will be chosen by default, as it were. Now, you can also set a default filing committee. In the same manner, you would choose the default checkbox here. One thing to note is that if you want to set a particular bank account as the default, you would open your filing committee, and you'll see a list of the accounts under that committee to choose which you wish to set as the default. So in general, to set the defaults, you choose Settings, Global Transaction Defaults, and choose the area where you want to set the default. If there's a subtype that corresponds to that default, you'll click on the name, and you can see there's a tooltip here saying Click Entry for Subtype Defaults. Now, another useful feature in 360 that financial specialists will find helpful is reconciling. And this allows you to take a bank statement and check your currently entered receipts or disbursements against it to make sure that your balances are the same. Currently, this area is available under Settings and Filing Committees. Once you've chosen the committee that you wish to reconcile for, you want to select the bank account that you wish to reconcile as well. This is available under Bank Accounts. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and reconcile the Doe account. Now, when doing bank reconciliation, you want to sit down with a bank statement that you wish to reconcile for. The process is pretty straightforward. You enter the date for transactions that you wish to pull up into the statement. So we're going to go ahead and look from the first of the year. And we can leave this to field open-ended. If you have a particular batch that you wish to reconcile for example, if you entered those contributions with a particular batch in mind, you could choose the batch field. I don't have a batch entered currently, so we're going to reconcile by transactions. Note that you can include transactions which have already been reconciled in case you wish to unreconcile something. So if your bank statement changes, you can go back and unreconcile all of the contributions in that area and re-reconcile them later with a different bank statement date. You can also choose to include unreconciled transactions that come from before the start date. If you're very vigilant in entering your transactions, this is a good box to check and make sure that you've reconciled everything that you've entered. Once you've chosen the search date, you can go ahead and enter the statement date of your particular bank statement. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run this search. Now, as you can see, we get Abraham Lincoln's contribution of $100 from today. This transaction has not yet been reconciled, so we're going to go ahead and check the button underneath R for reconcile, and we'll set our statement date of today. If you need to, you can view the particular transaction just to be certain it's the transaction you're looking for. As you can see, this is a receipt entered today, so we do want to reconcile it. With our statement date set and our transaction chosen, we can go ahead and click on the Reconcile button. As you can see, there are no more unreconciled transactions in this date range. If we include reconciled, we'll be able to pull up that same transaction again. And if we wanted to unreconcile the transaction for whatever reason, we can again either uncheck it, or we can choose to select all, or unselect all rather, to unreconcile these transactions. And once we click reconcile, it would unreconcile it. Now, if we go to Abraham's record, since we currently have that transaction reconciled, we can go ahead and open that transaction. I'm going to scratch that. So, another useful area of 360 is the ability to print checks for certain disbursements. Let's go ahead and make sure we have a disbursement entered for Abraham Lincoln. There we go. That was a confusion. I was looking at the wrong transaction. As you can see, our bank statement date has been set on this transaction after we reconciled it. So, with that disbursement transaction entered, we're going to go ahead and go to Settings and Filing Committees again. 360 provides you the ability to print checks for outstanding disbursements by date range. This is done by going to Settings and choosing the filing committee that you wish to print checks for. We then choose the bank account. And select the check printing pane. We can search by date for the transactions that we wish to print checks for. And specify a batch if we need to, or if those transactions have been organized by a batch. As you can see, our $100 transaction under disbursements in Abraham Lincoln appears, and we have the ability to choose whether we wish to print a check for this transaction or not. We can also view to make sure, once again, that this is the transaction we're looking for. Once we've selected the transactions we wish to print checks for, we can go ahead and go down to the bottom here where we can select our starting check number. Now, in order to print checks and be able to issue those, you want to order check stock printed with your bank account information on it. Those checks come with a preset number, so you want to choose the check number starting at the most recent check you have available in your stack of stock. In this case, we don't have stock, so we're going to choose number 1. You can choose your type to the right. This is going to depend on the kind of check stock that you have, and they're fairly generic. There is a brand, Deluxe, that we've already formatted specific formats to. There's also Intuit. We're going to choose a standard 3-part bottom check. After selecting the stock type, you can select which fields you wish to print. In this case, we can choose check number, election period, a note, and this is the note on the transaction itself, and whether or not we want to display the address. Just to remind you, the transaction notes are stored at the bottom of the transaction detail page. In this field. Once you've chosen the correct settings for your check, you can choose the Create Checks button. Once you've created your checks, the file generated is available at the bottom of the page here. And it's a PDF file which opens in Adobe Reader or any standard PDF viewer. And as you can see, our check is here, ready to be printed to a set of stock. So, finally, if we were to run an FEC report, we'd go to Reporting and Compliance Reports. Now you choose your filing authority from the drop-down box, and only the filing authorities that you report to will be set up to be available. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose FEC Form 3. As we mentioned, when you report transactions, in order to make sure you select the correct transactions to report, on your forms you choose the committee that you wish to report for and the accounts that you wish to include in that report. Only transactions for this committee and under these accounts will be reported, so it's important to make sure you have the correct selection here. As you can see, under Form Information, you can choose your report type, as well as the reporting date and threshold date, and set your itemization thresholds. One particular area that's important to note is the auto-generation area, where you can choose whether you wish to hand enter certain line totals or automatically generate them. You can also enter memo text if you wish to show this on your report. Finally, in the Saved Reports tab, you'll be able to view previous reports, whether or not they've been filed, and you can load the settings for those reports. So, that's a basic overview of our Aristotle 360 for financial transactions and reporting. Just to recap, we went over 3 different areas where transactions can be entered, and the type and subtype, and how they relate to compliance. We also looked at transaction linking, in this case relating to loans. We went over different searches you can run for receipts or disbursements, and how you can export those searches, particularly using reporting, financial, and transaction. We looked at check printing and reconciliation, and we did a brief overview of what the reporting module for compliance reports looks like in 360. That about covers it. Thank you very much for joining us today, and if you have any questions, remember you can contact us at support@aristotle.com. Thank you.